Hi, this is Shannon Diiorio. Thank you so much for tuning in to Living in the Brandywine Valley. Today we're talking about moving from Pennsylvania to Delaware. I have helped numerous clients move across state lines, and there's a lot of reasons that people like to do that, and there's also some differences in the process. So we're going to talk about some of those today. From Pennsylvania, the number one state that people are leaving Pennsylvania to move to is Florida. But the number one county people are leaving Pennsylvania to move to is Newcastle County, Delaware. So very common for people to just hop right over the state line into Newcastle County, Delaware. The number one benefit that people see moving to Delaware is the property taxes. So just to take as an example, a $500,000 house, if it was in Delaware County, you're probably looking at $8,000 to $12,000 in taxes. If it's in Chester County, you're probably looking somewhere around $5,000 a year in annual taxes. In Newcastle County, though, you can get the same house for probably maybe even less than $3,000 a year in taxes. So huge difference across the board there. Major benefit to moving to Delaware. Another benefit, if you qualify, is that you can even get a senior discount through Newcastle County on your property taxes. So there's some qualifications for that, but another huge benefit for people. So a few other benefits that people see about moving to Delaware is the tax-free shopping. There's no sales tax when you're shopping, so for especially larger purchases like furniture, things like that, that can be a huge benefit as well. It's just a little bit of a slower pace in Delaware. You don't need to get car inspections as often. You go every other year for a car inspection. First 7 years of a car's life, you don't need an inspection at all, or at least you don't need an emissions testing at all. Your distance to coastal towns, so lots of beach towns in the state, you're not that far away, even if you're in northern Delaware. There's beautiful state parks throughout the state and just a strong sense of community among the many different developments throughout the state. A couple of the potential drawbacks moving into Delaware is beach traffic, number one. So I have helped people that work in the city of Philadelphia but could get more house for the money because of the lower property taxes by coming to Delaware. I always warn people though, Friday afternoon traffic going back home is going to be rough during the summer, right? There's a ton of beach traffic, so that's just something to be aware of. Give yourself time for your commute. The state income tax rate can be a little bit higher than it is in Pennsylvania. In Pennsylvania, there's a flat state income tax rate, whereas in Delaware, it depends on your income bracket. So you might end up paying a little bit more in your state income taxes. In addition to the drawbacks of the state income tax, there is also kind of a lack of basements in the area. So there's a high water table throughout the state of Delaware, and at least in northern Delaware, the soil is a very hard clay. So we see quite a bit of wet areas around the northern part of the state. The final potential drawback to moving to Delaware is there can be a lack of public transportation options. We have the city of Wilmington, the city of Dover, so there's some areas with more public transportation, but if you're in the suburban areas, there's just not a lot of options there. So you're going to be pretty dependent on having your own vehicle. Some of the differences in the process in moving from Pennsylvania to Delaware, and where I see this come into play a lot of times is if someone is selling their house in Pennsylvania, where the contract is a little bit buyer favorable, and then they're buying a property in Delaware where the contract is a little bit more seller favorable. So they kind of feel like they're getting the short end of the stick in both scenarios. And when I say that the contract is buyer or seller favorable, I'm talking about the standard state contracts. In the state of Pennsylvania, when a buyer does a home inspection, if they elect that contingency, they can just terminate the contract and get out of it, and in most cases get their deposit money back. Whereas in Delaware, that's not necessarily an option. In Delaware, your option is to ask the seller to correct any undisclosed defects. And if the seller agrees to correct them, then you've got to move forward. You wouldn't have the opportunity to just terminate the contract. So that is one of the major differences between the two states, just as part of the process. And when I mentioned undisclosed defects in Delaware, if a seller discloses up front that maybe a window is broken, or maybe there's aluminum wiring, which that can be common in the Newcastle County areas to have aluminum wiring. If they disclose that up front, that wouldn't be something that would be negotiable as part of the home inspection process, even if it is a defect. Whereas in Pennsylvania, that's not the case. In both states, it's very important to read the seller's disclosure thoroughly, but even more so in Delaware, just to really scrutinize, is there any part of that you're going to want to negotiate as part of the process? You're going to need to do it up front rather than waiting until the home inspection process. Some of the more minor differences is that in Pennsylvania, you buy a property with oil heat, whatever oil is in the tank, buyer gets it for free at settlement. Whereas in Delaware, that gets measured and estimated as to the value of the oil in the tank, and then the buyer is reimbursing the seller for that oil at the time of closing. So minor difference, but still something to be aware of. Just a couple of other procedural differences going from state to state is that in Pennsylvania, closings are handled by title companies, whereas in Delaware, they're handled by attorneys. It's not an attorney state in the way that New Jersey is, so there's no 3-day attorney review period, but we do have attorneys that handle the actual closing and review paperwork with the buyer. Another procedural difference is surveys. Delaware is a survey state. So as part of the closing process, there's going to be a survey done of the property that you're purchasing. Whereas in Pennsylvania, that's only if that's negotiated between the buyer and seller. And I would say, by and large, in the southeastern part of Pennsylvania at least, there's very few surveys that are done as part of the process. Another major difference is that most areas in southeastern Pennsylvania require a use and occupancy as part of the closing process. And a use and occupancy is when someone from the township comes through the property and does an inspection and makes sure that the property meets township code. In most areas in Delaware, Newcastle County especially, these are not done. One final difference that usually doesn't come into play, closings are not commonly delayed, but if a closing is delayed for some reason, in Pennsylvania, it requires both parties to agree in writing to extend the closing date. And if they don't agree to do so, then we've kind of have an issue. It's not automatically extended. We've got to figure something out, negotiate something, right, or the sale falls through. Whereas in Delaware, it's pre-written in the contract that if there's a delay or if there's extra time needed for that survey or for paperwork review, that the closing date is automatically extended. So that's something that's really important to know, especially if you're moving from out of the area, moving to Delaware, you're really depending on that date. You've got your movers lined up. Something to be aware of, you might need to be a little bit flexible. So if the lender needs more time, or maybe they need more time for the survey, things could end up getting delayed by a few days to accommodate for that. So while some of these differences are kind of minor, others can really have a huge impact on you and your purchase. So it's really, really important, especially if you're looking in both states or if you are selling in one state, buying in another state. It's really important to find an agent that is very familiar with the process, procedures, and regulations and contracts in both states. It's one thing to have a license in both states, but it's a totally different story to be very familiar and to really understand how the process works in each state.